I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like Live. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. Please, again, check us out at imixwhatilike.org and be sure to subscribe there so that you don't miss any of the things that we do collectively there across a variety of platforms and medium and media and with a variety of different folks. So please do that, imixwhatilike.org. Follow us at imixwhatilike for all your relevant social media. And as usual, please, again, I've already put the link in the YouTube, and I'll put it, of course, at imixwhatilike.org. Sign up for the Political Prisoner newsletter from Freedom Archives and Jericho movement, and do something to support political prisoners. Write them, call somebody, something, share, make them part of your conversation, your analysis. And we're going to, obviously look to do that more and more here as well through a variety of different ways, including some guests and other things that I'm trying to work on. So please stick around for that. Do all the things like subscribe, retweet, share, invite people to join us live, put your comments, critiques, queries, conundrums, catechisms, cacophony, calumny, all in the chat. And join the conversation, which we will get to shortly with you. But before we do that, I'm going to invite our guest, who I'm very excited to have join us this morning here on the East Coast. It's well into the afternoon where she is on the West Coast of Africa in Ghana, where she is a research fellow in the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. Where she also teaches history and politics section of the Institute. Her teaching, research, and advocacy interests are in the areas of Pan-African political thought, African diaspora, cultural and political identity, decolonization of knowledge production, and race and identity in the African diaspora. And she's also one of our colleagues and comrades in the Blacklash Africana Collective, which is taking a break currently, which is why I'm inviting them all on individually. And we'll resume next month with a variety of town halls and discussions. And of course, I'm talking about Dr. Mjiba Frehiwot. And I should also say, by the way, she is also a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which is an organization I have endeavored to follow, mimic, and at one point join. Good morning, good afternoon, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate you.
Good morning, Jared. Good afternoon. Greetings from Ghana. Thank you very much for having me.
So there's a lot I want us to get to, but I wanted to start, as I said before we did get started, with this sort of broad question because, well, for a number of reasons. We hear a lot about identity and identity politics. Right. And I wanted to start with this question of what role you think identity plays in politics as someone who is, as I just introduced, researching identity and its role in the African diaspora, but also somebody who has been directly and for a long time involved in grassroots organization. What role does identity play?
Well, I mean, okay, so first of all, let me just say this, that identity is not just something that African people have to be concerned with, right? Identity is a concept that's universal. The concept of identity, right? One identifies with many things. So one could identify with their hometown. One identifies with their family lineage, right? One identifies with their ethnicity, one identifies with the language. Depending on where you find yourself, you may identify with a certain, continent. You might, in spaces in the US, one identifies with a block, right? So in DC, you identify with Southeast or Northeast or Northwest, right? In the Bay, where I was born, one identifies with Oakland and Berkeley and Richmond, and right? So identity is like something that oftentimes is unspoken, but it really sort of dictates who we are, right? So the other issue with identity is, I'm coming to your question, but the other issue with identity is, if in fact one doesn't make a critical decision to determine who and how and with what they identify, then one can be bamboozled, right? And so I think that this is the first issue of the relationship between identity and politics, right? Because identity oftentimes is dictated by the ruling class and politics, or identity is dictated by one resisting the ruling class and politics, right? And so if in fact one accepts the conventional societal identity of who they are, that often dictates their class, it often dictates their position economically, it often dictates their ability to access education and to even, in some cases, dream beyond where they find themselves, right? And so identity is honestly like a really political thing. Something that oftentimes we don't even think through what is our identity, right? We don't even think about the fact that our identity and the construction of our identity is a political animal, right? We don't think, how do we identify? You know, who are we and what makes our identity, right? And so what ends up happening is if we don't even think about how we're identifying, we can't determine if our identity is a positive or negative thing for us. And I'll give you an example. You know, leading up to becoming a Pan-Africanist, I was in high school and, you know, I don't think that I was clear about being an African, right? I thought, oh, I'm an African American or I'm Black or whatever the case may be. And I was born in Berkeley, raised in upstate New York, right? So in Berkeley, the parts of California, how can I say it nicely? It's real like loosey-goosey about identity, right? So-called loosey-goosey, right? Of course, that doesn't apply to everybody, but the society tries to make it appear as though race and class and gender are not deterrents for people's success. But the reality is, on the ground, it absolutely is. Long story short, I moved to upstate New York, where identity is real clear. You're Black or you're white. You live in the upper class neighborhood or you live with the poor folks, right? Period, end of story. My family, of course, lived with the people, right? And so at that point, I began to start having internal identity construction conversations with myself, unbeknownst to myself, right? And then when you begin to look at things like some people don't have access to resources and others do, and their identity dictates where they find themselves, then you begin to start saying there's something about this identity thing. And then when I moved back from Rochester, New York, and let me just say something about identity and Rochester, New York. The last time I checked, I'm sure the statistics are better, but the last time I checked, Black men in Rochester graduate only 9% of the time from high school. I hope you understand the deepness of that, right? 9% of Black boys graduate from high school in Rochester, New York. So there's some identity there, isn't there, right? And what one can or cannot do in a space like Rochester, New York. Whole other issue. Anyhow, went back to Berkeley and I took this class in the African American Studies department at Berkeley High School. And I began to really be exposed to African identity and what that looked like. But I also began to ask critical questions about class. How come some people had and some people didn't have, right? And so all of these things to suggest that, one, our identity is never, as specifically folks who live in the US, let me say it is, one is not given a choice about what their identity is because society identifies you, right? Two, if you're lucky enough to be born into a Pan-African institution or a revolutionary or progressive institution, i.e. family, or engage with, then perhaps you're challenging or questioning your identity, right? But then we also don't know how powerful that identity is, right? And I'll stop here by saying that Malcolm X said that a tree without roots dies, right? Something of that nature. So your identity is directly connected to your history and culture and even your language. And if one is disconnected from their history and culture, it's very difficult to identify, right? And so then you take whatever identity society promotes or society or whatever identity society tells you that you are through formal and informal education, and the politics around identity, that choice of identity construction is taken from you until you wake up and be like, boop, 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 I am not what society tells me, but I can identify myself and connect that to a history, to a culture, to a land base, and even to resistance. I don't know if I answered the question, but I tried.
You did. I think you did a lot, and it has spawned a lot. And I want to ask. So first, I just want to say that. So I want to come back to this idea that you've raised, if I've understood it correctly, that everyone is operating under or with some form or another of socially constructed identity.
Absolutely.
All right. I want to come back to that, but there's a particular question that formed in my mind because I just hosted Adolph Reed the other day talking about Black Lives Matter, who has his own particular approach that I find interesting, if not, as I guess would be the case in everything, all encompassing. But this question, because he said something to the effect that race is a product of capitalist production. And I want to ask you, because and even hosting debates and conversations within the African community for a long time, and I want to sort of put this spin on it for you to answer. Why would it matter today whether or not race is a product of capitalist construction or production, or the product of, to simplify, Yorugu, that is a European cultural ethic coined by, of course, Dr. Marimba Ani, that is the old materialist versus culture argument. Is it capitalism? Is it white supremacy? But just framed in that way. What difference would it make today, from your perspective, if there is a difference? Whether race is a product of capitalist or cultural production? So
honestly, I really don't know if there makes much of a difference, right? Race is socially constructed, right? For me, let me just be clear that the fundamental contradiction is capitalism. White supremacy is also a contradiction, right? White supremacy evolved out of this question of capitalism. White supremacy you don't see white supremacy until you start seeing slavery, until you start seeing colonialism, until you start seeing neocolonialism, right? And so many people can debate me on this, not a problem. You certainly can come up for the debate. But I think for me, honestly, race is a social construct. Now, with that being the case, it being a social construct does not mean that we cannot use race, right, in order to fight back against imperialism and capitalism. But we must understand that it is a social construct. And see, the problem that we have when we suggest that it's not a social construct, right? And we don't acknowledge that one's race doesn't necessarily correspond to their history, to their culture, and even to their landmass, right? Because I think that when we think about race as something that, Black people are just Black people, right? There's no Black land. So how do you connect back to one's homeland, right? Regardless as to where you happen to find yourself. And so this question of the social construction of race is that it was socially constructed to oppress people, specifically African people, right? And it certainly emerged out of capitalism, because the reality is, listen, Jerry, I mean, 200, 400 years ago, you can't roll up into anybody's town in Europe and be like, you know what? I think we want to just go and steal some African people, and because these are other humans, by the way, but we need free labor. So let's just steal them. And then some European that has, an ounce of sense is going to be like, wait a minute, are you talking about stealing human beings? Like, that doesn't sound correct, right? Maybe that's slavery. Maybe, and then the other person is going to say, well, why not? Well, then why wouldn't you just steal Europeans? So because people would begin to question, why are you stealing human beings that are equal to you, right? That's like stealing your brother or stealing your whatever. So then you have to come up with some reason why you're taking some people from their land and making them have free labor. So then you have to construct, right, a difference between peoples, right, which is based on quote unquote race, if we may, in order to dictate that African people are less than human. So therefore they need to be somehow saved by Africans. I mean, by Europeans. And the same thing, and listen, this is not some new stuff, right? Europeans was pillaging across Europe way before they found themselves in Africa. I mean, like, you don't have to take my word for it. Do some research. And all you have to do is go on Netflix. If you're a Netflix watcher, they have all those shows about the Vikings that go across, were sailing across Europe and conquering other people for capital, right? So this is not new to the world. Race is a construction to completely control people and make them believe that what's happening is correct, and make people who are Black and brown believe that they are not, relevant enough. They are not human enough. They don't have the intelligence to then begin to question what is happening. But the reality is it's a social construct, whether it came from white supremacy, whether it came from capitalism. Quite frankly, it's oppressing our people, and we must address it head on. But the problem that you have is we could wipe out white supremacy right now, right? And when we say white supremacy, we're not talking about necessarily Europeans. We're talking about the system of white supremacy. But some people confuse white supremacy with white people, right? If I'm not mistaken, that doesn't matter, because if we don't address the systems of capitalism and white supremacy and oppression, both based on race, but also based on the stealing and pillaging of raw resources, both human and inhuman, material and immaterial. It doesn't matter, because you'll have African people, I don't mean no harm, you'll have African and indigenous folks oppressing other people, because we've not looked at the fundamental contradiction, that being capitalism, that being profit over people. Long story short, I hope that answered it. I'm not sure if I did. I think I went off a bit.
No, I think it's all on topic. Would you say that the percentage of white people in Ghana corresponds to the prevalence of white supremacy in Ghana?
So here's the thing. First of all, let me just say this. I love, just a side note, which has nothing to do with the question. I love this Panther newspaper, and I have the whole 1967 year, and I'm going to use it as something coming up.
Anyways. And I'll explain. There's a background to the background, but I'm glad you. I can't
stop looking at the Panthers, and I love the Panthers and political education. Whole other story. Anyhow, so first of all, I think that the absolute presence of people of European descent. So let me say this. White supremacy and exploitation based on capitalism or globalization or U.S. imperialism really isn't dictated by how many white people you see. So first of all, I can go days without seeing a European. Like yesterday, I don't think I saw a European. Oh no, I did see some, because I went to this place called Jamestown Cafe. Oh shoot, my bad. But if I stay on my side of town, right, I can go days or weeks without seeing a European. That doesn't necessarily dictate, whether there's white supremacy or whether there's U.S. imperialist forces in Ghana, right? For me, I don't care whether I see Europeans or not. What I care about is where our oil is going. What I care about is, are we getting fair prices for our cocoa? What I care about is our bauxite going up out of here, raw, and then coming back to us in a refined form. You know what I'm saying? My concern is, this Gallon C, we call it Gallon C. Basically, we have, sort of small scale people who are digging for gold, and they sell it to these larger companies, right? And the larger companies oftentimes rip people off. But the problem with that is that these small scale sort of people who really are struggling economically and have no choice, that their methods are not approved for sort of environmental, safeguarding the environment. And so what happens is negatively impacts our river flow and our water flow. And many of these large corporations that are coming in to Ghana digging for oil, they don't care anything about our environment. So it exacerbates anything that these small scale folks are doing. So I don't want anyone to think that I'm suggesting that small scale gold diggers are killing our waterways. It's really the larger sort of corporations that are either paying people to do this at really cheap prices, by the way, or using their machines and ultimately, grading down stuff so that when it rains, everything floods into our waterways and people don't have quality drinking water. So long story short, I don't care if it's 100 million Europeans or 2 Europeans in Ghana. That don't mean nothing. If we are not controlling our resources, we have IMF and World Bank loans, we can't feed our people. It's here. No matter how many Europeans you see. Now, if you go to South Africa, for example, let's be clear. That joker will make you angry. And that's a place where race is like, I was born and raised in the US, and South Africa will make you want to, you know what I'm saying, come outside. It'll bring you back to your hood days, you know what I'm saying, in South Africa, because the amount of class differences in South Africa is appalling beyond comprehension. So, for example, I was in last year, I think it was January of this year, actually, or December 2019, we went to a conference at Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch is this uppity sort of like, everyone goes and they drink wine in Stellenbosch and blah, 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 and X, Y, and Z. And, there's these nice resorts and all you see is Europeans and blah, 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 and people driving fancy cars. But to get to Stellenbosch from the Cape Town airport, you drive by the largest shanty town you didn't see in your entire life. I mean, it's blocks upon blocks. It's like 20 minutes to drive past it on the highway. And then you see in the morning, Black South Africans walking or on a bus to come and work, in Stellenbosch in these quote unquote posh, hotels and spaces or clean somebody's house. And then they got to walk back out at night. And so then you think to yourself, self, I don't know how folks are living here, because it would have, and which is why you see a lot of these explosions. Same thing in Cape Town, same thing when you go across the country. So then you begin to question this question about race and how, although it's socially constructed, it is absolutely being used to oppress people, right? I mean, like, look at the percentage of white South African, quote unquote, white European oppressors who happen to be in South Africa, right? Like let's look at this really, right? And I say that unless you are a person of European descent and were born in South Africa and you are absolutely against the post-apartheid regime, because we have pre-apartheid, apartheid, and then post-apartheid. I would suggest we're in neo-apartheid, right? Unless you're against that regime, then you're part and parcel of the problem, right? But then to look at the percentage of Africans in South Africa and look at who's dying, right? Look at during COVID where people are screaming that they can't eat. You know what? Listen, if you make me stay in the house, I can't eat. I'll die of starvation. But do you think that those white folks in Stellenbosch are saying that if they can't come out the house, they'll die for COVID? Please. Long story short, I've diverged. Sorry.
No, listen, every time it comes up, I'm reminded, and, my Southern African personal experience is limited. But one took place at the Africana Center at Cornell, the Africana Studies and Research Center. Shout out to Dr. James Turner once again, who at one point when we were there, this is already 20 years ago, he had brought Desmond Tutu as a guest. Or I should say Cornell University had brought Desmond Tutu as a guest. And what the beauty of being at the Africana Center was that any big name African anywhere in the world that came gave a private, separate gathering to Africana. So we had this private small classroom sitting with Desmond Tutu. He gives his basic, I guess a slightly blacker version of what he was going to say to the university. And patiently waiting was his brother in the back, and he stood up and was crying and was shaking and was barely containing himself. And he just snapped and he said, "You come here, you give these speeches, you talk this madness, you collect your check." And he said, "My people in the township," I can't even remember where he was from. He said, "My people in the township have it worse than when it was under apartheid." That was his, he said it was worse. He said, "We don't have water. We don't have food." He said this, he said, "You all," and he pointed to Tutu. He said, "You all have your nice cars and houses." And Tutu's response was in part, I thought, telling, but also very real, because he said, just as he had written in I think some biography he had published at that time that I remember reading, where he said, one, unlike, because a comparison was made to the Nuremberg trials after World War II and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and the differences, which were cavernous. And Tutu said, but the differences were that in South Africa, we didn't win. So that was one. He was very clear. We did not win. We came to a draw. And that's why we had the Reconciliation Commission. But then he also yeah, I mean, that was basically it. He just basically said, we didn't win. So, there's not more else I can do. And then he finished his talk by saying, I think I've sung enough for my food. And I remember, ooh, man, that just sounded so bad. Like go, it's time for me to eat. I've talked enough. But the other thing, so that was the sort of the class thing for me. The race thing was. But
let me say this though. Go ahead. I don't think that it's about, he said, I want to eat. I think what he's suggesting is that he's going around the world and he's no different than an NBA player that's playing for his check.
Wow. Well, okay.
I'm just saying.
Fair enough.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. The only other thing I was going to say was that when I did get to go to Zimbabwe some years ago, the racial part was I had a small meeting with members of the quote unquote colored community. Who, on one hand, first of all, it's just fascinating who's considered colored in this group, because it could be anybody who looks damn near white or Indian, I guess, as in East Indian, or anybody who looks like the straight up most indigenous African on the continent, and they're all part of this community. But being told about it from their perspective, being created specifically to be a buffer class against the coming African revolution that the Europeans
absolutely,
and being played off of each other with this who is identified. So what if you accept the colored identity? Can you become an African if you're part of the colored community? Can you identify at least politically with the African side of the struggle? It was all very deep. Yeah. It was just all very deep and prevalent to this day. So I didn't really have another question for you. I'm just saying anything you wanted to add or respond to is in that. And people, I see you in the chats. Please keep it up with the questions. We'll get to them is in just a minute, but in fact, we'll go now if you don't know what
I mean. I just want to. No, I just wanted to say that this question about colored folks is like a quintessential question about identity. So, are you telling me that my only identity, and let's not? I mean, I'm not downplaying like colored culture or ethnicity or whatever the case may be. Like, I'm not downplaying any of that, right? But are you coming to tell me, Jerry, that an identity was created for me so that I could be a buffer between Africans and Europeans? I mean, like, that is the quintessential use of identity against a people beyond, and it's political at that. You know what I'm saying? And think about it. For me, you're thinking about what is this? And I know we talked about this on the Blacklash thing, and I don't know, some people kind of felt some kind of way about it, whatever. But I think that this goes back to this. I know you know where I'm going with this, right? But I think this goes back to this question about this multi-ethnic identity that's being pushed in the U.S., right? Mm-hmm. Quite frankly, it's anti-African. Let's not confuse ourselves. Because when we think about being you notice no one is like, I'm a proud African, I'm a proud indigenous, and I'm a proud Korean. No, people like, oh, I'm multi-ethnic, right? Because it's an anti-African identity construction that's given by society, which ultimately is again just like this colored buffer. The other thing, last thing I just want to point out about this is when you have this hodgepodge, multi-ethnic colored identity, where is your culture? Where does your history start? Are you coming to tell me as a colored person sitting in South Africa that my history started when the colonialists, the apartheid regime identified me as being colored? Are you coming to tell me that's where my history started? So even beginning to identify and ask questions about our identity would then begin to say, wait a minute, my history started before this, so why am I identifying as that? And I liken it to this. One day you wake up and you start identifying me as a chair. And then and then think about it. No disrespect, but let's think about it, Jared. You know what I'm saying? So then in 4 generations, my children are identified as chairs. And then someone begins to ask them, well, what's the history of your chair ethnicity? Are we going to go back and say Jerry started identifying Mjiba as a chair? Like, again, I'm not disrespecting anybody's identity, you know, because when you think about it.
But you say it, and I know people will want to think, and actually, if you have headphones, it might help to put them on. It might help with the echo.
I don't have headphones because, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm just, yeah, anyway, but no, it's funny you say that, and people might be inclined to laugh or not take it seriously. But if you think about it, what really is the difference from becoming in a few generations a chair from having been not that many generations ago Yoruba or Igbo or something else? And as some of us have started to look at our DNAs and our heritage, I mean, you can actually see, for those of us who didn't know already, it doesn't take that long, and we were something very, very different. And then even since being here, we have been a variety of African to nigger and Negro and colored and Afro-American and African-American. And I mean, and all of that has been politically imposed and constructed for a variety of different reasons to help one group exploit another. So anyway, when I hear you say that, I mean, my initial reaction is to laugh at the idea of, okay, yeah, my great grandchild is going to be a chair, but it's not. I mean, who knows? I mean, they could be defined as something much worse. So as John Henrik Clarke, of course, said, black tells you how you look, but not who you are. All people's identity has to relate to land, history, and culture.
Exactly.
So Todd has been has been active in the comment section here and asked this question: when does one stop or start being an African? And I always remember that parable that I first heard from Ben Yokin and Doc Ben about the some say he got it from Malcolm, some say vice versa. Probably somebody else really came up with it first, but because everybody was on the street corner, just like everybody has a live stream today. Everybody was on the street corner in the 1900s. But anyway, but you know, the whole thing of if you take rabbits out of the woods and put them in an oven and they procreate, is their offspring a biscuit? So when does someone start or stop being African?
This is an excellent question, and I think it's a critical question, right? I think there's two things. One, I think that you can be African ideologically, you can be African biologically, you know, you can be African geographically, right? And honestly, people can have African DNA and not even identify with being African, right? So it's like, on one hand, like biologically, one is an African. But the question for me, which is more fundamental than their biological Africanity, is, are they politically an African, right? Are they ideologically an African, right? Are they thinking about the African continent and African people globally in everything that they do, right? Or are they exploiting African people? Or are they like Mobutu in the Congo, who clearly he's biologically an African? I mean, somebody who kills and chops up Lumumba and then takes reign and oppresses people beyond comprehension and then leaves office with a floating central bank and has stolen more money in the history of Africa than one can even conceive. I don't think that person is an African, right? So for me, I think that there's a question about political Africanity. There's a question about biological Africanness, right? Because honestly, quite frankly, I would rather be down with a European that's about fighting US imperialism and is clear about their role in that fight than an African that thinks that they are part of the petty bourgeois and their primary concern is getting in the office, right? Or becoming somebody's minister or becoming somebody's senator. I don't mean any harm. I'm not disrespecting nobody that's been in office, but we do know some quote unquote African presidents who did not do anything positive for Africa. I'm not even and I'm not talking about African presidents in Africa.
Shout out to
That's
the
it.
Godfather, Mr. Tom Porter. Only he, she who has left the source is in need of a return to the source.
Absolutely, absolutely. Hey, I love Amilcar Cabral. Absolutely. And you know what? And that's an interesting thing too, because one has left the source either voluntarily. One has left the source, involuntary, force, right? So many of our people left the source from a forced perspective. And then also people have left the source ideologically, right? Because slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism certainly did a number on our people ideologically, right? And so you could be in the source, but have left the source. You know what I'm saying? And so it's like, even when you think about whether one is on because the thing is, being on the continent doesn't necessarily mean that you are an African, right? Or even identify as being an African, right? And being outside of the continent also doesn't mean that's the case as well, right? And so I think that Amilcar Cabral, Unity Struggle and all of these amazing pieces that he writes about is real clear that we must return to the source, but we must also identify where we were either taken away from the source or where we drifted from the source. And then let me also say this. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, sometimes we could be anti-African and then transition and transform our ideology to be pro-African, right? Because we are humans, right? And so let's look at Malcolm, let's look at Martin, like in the beginning of their career, they weren't talking about Africa, they weren't talking about internationalism, right? Until they began to evolve their ideological understanding of the larger international struggle, right? And then all of a sudden, they became more aware and embraced this question of Africanness, right? And so I'm suggesting that the source, it's about one, finding out where the source is, and then also figuring out where your disconnect from the source came, and then trying to figure out how to get your way back to the source.
You started on this path even just a minute ago, but certainly earlier. And since if we're going to have the heavy hitters weighing in like Tom Porter and now Dhoruba bin Wahad, we should honor them at least with a little bit of an attempt. So as Dhoruba is saying, please project an understanding of African geopolitics, reality of African government versus U.S. policy. If I project an understanding of African geopolitics, reality of African government and U.S. policy, how to interpret that comment, and what is the relationship between geopolitics, in this case, identity, and the U.S. government?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you very much, Elder and freedom fighter, political person, all of that, right? For that comment. Absolutely correct. First of all, we can't talk about African politics or without talking about geopolitics, right? We have to talk about the political economy. We have to look at sort of the world from a very political perspective, right? And ask ourselves, why is Africa politically, from an identity perspective, right? Why is Africa where Africa finds herself? And it's because of the geopolitics of the world, right? It's because there's a so-called first and third world. And I say so-called because there's no first, third, second, fourth, right? So there's this so-called global north and global south. There's, U.S. policies and UK policies that are really implemented to continue to oppress African people, right? And so I think that's the first issue, is that African governments find themselves in a position where they're exporting goods that they could produce into raw materials and could actually get more money for, but they're exporting it at low raw material prices, and they're importing everything else. And that's ultimately because of this question of geopolitics. That's because of slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism. It's because African countries have cash crops. It's because African countries are dependent on the global market. And so African countries have the global market, and that's where they have to sell their products in order to get money, in order to import everything from toothpicks to food, to rice, to cars, to clothes. And so you begin to see the cycle, right? And then, of course, U.S. policy has never been a friendly towards Africa, because the reality is the moment that U.S. policy begins to become friendly and or maybe not even friendly, let's see, the moment that U.S. policy begins to say that we must treat Africa, the continent, equitably, then the U.S. will lose its dominance in the world, right? Because if you think about it, if let's look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? If U.S. policy said that we will not import any electronic devices that use coltan out of the Congo unless those who harvested were properly compensated, unless that company put up schools and medical facilities and provided, 20% of the profits to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right, for infrastructure. That moment, then Microsoft and HP and all these corporations who really run, right, this capitalist system, not necessarily the U.S. government, will begin to they'll lose their profits. They'll lose their edge. So it's not in the best interest of the U.S. to have equitable, fair, non-exploitative policies towards Africa, and not just Africa, towards the rest of us in spaces outside of the U.S. I mean, so hopefully, I don't know if I've done any service to that question, but I think it's very much tied and connected to everything. And go ahead.
I was going to say, if we don't do a service one way or another, Daruba will let us know. So I have no doubt about that,
exactly.
as will many others. But I think also I had to add that in terms of this conversation about identity, I mean, not only have Europeans constructed and adopted their own identities for their own political purposes and then look to impose them on the rest of the planet, to this day, I'm not sure that any geopolitical entity is not itself a creation of and named by in response to European imperialism. So from whether it's the Berlin Conference to AFRICOM, the Western world has been dividing up, naming, and imposing itself on the continent and the rest of the planet for several hundred years now, for just as you were saying, for the purposes of extracting all the land, labor, or the resources, the land and that the land and the labor produces, and the wealth produced from all of that. So to have radical reconstructions of identity, including is something I know you wanted us to talk a little bit about, but the idea of a United States of Africa, and the history of even that concept. I mean, these become political threats. So I mean, this is sort of why I started off this conversation with that question, because whenever I hear in the mainstream someone make some sort of vague reference to identity politics, it's usually meant in some liberal, disparaging, or neoliberal disparaging way to say, oh, Black people, don't start talking about race, and you other groups don't start talking about your, that's just silliness. And even in some so-called progressive struggles, as Mr. Porter always reminds, even among some Marxist communist circles, where class becomes supreme, they're like, you all can go ahead and have your little nationhood and nationalisms. We're off to something else. Although I will say, just quickly on another tangent, in terms of communication studies history, that is what Europeans did. They said, as your Africans were decolonizing, they said, fine, have your little nations. We are going to create supranational entities like the World Bank and the IMF and other formations. But in terms of communications, we're going to be beaming our satellites into wherever you are, into whatever you call yourselves, and impacting your thought processes and culture that way. So we don't really care. But it's still in some ways a disparaging, demeaning context. But there is also a threat that when people become something else, and there is a logic or a behavior that follows suit. So as is pictured in the background, as Dr. Huey Newton would end up saying, power is in the ability to define phenomena and have it act in a desired manner. So if people redefine themselves as Africans and organize and behave that way, then they become a different kind of problem to those who have constructed this current form. So anyway, I that's really, in terms of a geopolitical question, that's how I understand at least this topic, and why I think it's so important to have these kinds of conversations about how does one become radically self-identified as in some other way. I don't, the final version to me isn't so important. Anyway, anything that you want to respond to or clarify or
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I think, like, when we think about this question of identity and radical identity construction, right? Some people have a problem with, oh, I'm not an African, or I'm not going to identify being an African, or this, that, and the next, or the Akebulan is the original name of Africa, so shouldn't we be Akebulanians? And African is a term that has been imposed, on people that come from that soil, and I think I agree. Excellent. I agree. And I think that the problem is not about what we call ourselves. I think the problem is ultimately about the fact that we haven't been able to, or we don't have the agency, or haven't taken our agency to identify ourselves, right? To me, that's radical identity construction, right? Resistance against those who oppress us. And there was just a flash around the institution of finance capital. These institutions are identity construction institutions, right? So let's not even talk about race as an identity. There is identity construction in the giver of money and the receiver of money, right? Let's think through this. The giver of money has power. The receiver of money has no power. There's identity constructed there, very political identity. There's identity construction between professors or lecturers and students. Now, we know Paulo Freire suggests that education should be a transformative, adventure, right? I would not say I'm necessarily a Freirean, right? But I take a lot of my teaching philosophy from Paulo Freire, right? Because he suggests in Pedagogy of the Oppressed and all the Education for Transformation that there's a bond between everyone in a space, right? That's an alternative type of identity construction. So I think that the thing about identity is we oftentimes think it's just about race, or we think it's just about, who we are. But we have to recognize that society identifies us. We have to recognize that our lack of pushback identifies us. Institutions identifies us. The global world identifies us. And so I think as African people, or the African continent, or global Africa, we will not have the power to self-identity for radical identity construction until Africa is unified, right? Kwame Nkrumah said it, Sekou Touré said it, Amilcar Cabral said, this is not new news, right? The Pan-Africanist Congress, the Black Panther Party, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, millions of people, we can name people that are clear. And actually, let's also be clear about something. Although people are jubilating or laughing or thinking that African unity is just a myth, why do we have the European Union? Why would European countries be unified? Why? Now let's remind ourselves.
Or NATO, for that matter. And why is Australia in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
So how come everyone else can unify and use their Black power to dictate their best interests, which may or may not be humanistic, right? How come everyone else can unify, right? But it's a pipe dream for African people. But we know a couple things around, and all of this has to do with identity politics. One, that until African people unify, what will happen? These Africans who are being shot dead in the street, from the police, will continue to happen from U.S. to Bahia. Didn't you see in the news that 2 young girls, 4 and 7, African girls, got shot by police in Brazil? The police come in, they shoot into a community because they think there's some quote unquote illegal activity going on in the favela. Okay? From Brazil, Bahia to the Bronx until Africa is unified. People will still struggle to eat until African people are unified, right? People will still be dying of diseases like COVID-19 until African people are unified, right? So we need to think about it, and you won't even be, and the thing about identity construction, which is so deadly, is that we don't understand how powerful it is. Think about the power and the transformation between one when they realized that they were free, whether they were free or not, and when they thought that they were a slave, right? That's a different dynamic. A slave thinks that they will always be a slave, but a free man, regardless or woman, regardless of her current circumstances, recognizes that she will always be free, right? And so for me, this is the critical point of identity construction. Because until I realize that our identity dictates our politics, dictates our economic position, dictates whether we have access to healthcare, and our push for it and our resistance against the social construction of our identity is many times pushed farther and farther away from our homeland as African people, we are going to continue to be in the same position that we find ourselves, right? And in 50 years, we'll be cheers.
So I just want to say I see Todd and some others out there talking about the opposite of soda in the chat, and I don't want anybody to be confused into thinking that I don't speak for Mjiba, but that I am hesitant to deal with that conversation. I just am hesitant to have that conversation dominate this one, primarily because I've already addressed that myself, and people can go to imixwhatilike.org and there's plenty of material there, both written and in audio and visual presentation on that, in full context response. I go way back with the founders, and they have been so disingenuous. And this is another reason why I'm not interested in getting into that today, at least, and unless Mjiba wants to pick it up, then that's up to her for sure. Is that they've been so disingenuous. They've been invited to debate me on at least one occasion and backed out. They don't communicate without hostility, even though we've got history and gone back and forth. So, I mean, they don't invite me or people with these politics to their platforms to have these conversations. And they're often conducted, again, without any goal of political advance or organization or anything. So I'm not really interested in dealing with that. But other than to say this, and on top of what I've already said, identity construction, self-selected identity construction or political identity construction can be both reactionary or revolutionary. So we have plenty of people in our community who walk around and they say, you know, I am the thug, I am the bitch, I am the hoe, I am the nigger, I am the this, I mean, you know, we've all on some level gone through that and had just our moments. You think I'm that, I'm gonna be that. You know, I'm you know, you want to see that, I will give you that. Or we have our, you know, so there's all kinds of, you know, we have people who self-identify as American, as Republican, as, you know, as not having a racial background. They could be black as night and talking about I'm just an American, or I'm just a Panamanian, or I'm just a Cuban. I'm not, you know, so all of this, so there are any number of different ways. What we're talking about, and that's why it's even titled in this way, radical Pan-African identity formation. We're talking about a very different trajectory and the context for that. So I'm only interested in SODA, Solidarity of Dispersed Africans, and not the backwards or reverse of that. Anyway, Dr. Frehiwot, please, if anything you'd like to say about that or anything I've just said, please go ahead. I don't know exactly what I said that got this, but Daruba, I appreciate it, and thanks for watching, and I'll take the thumbs up from you anytime. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, honestly, I agree with you. And let me be clear. I'm a member of an organization that has over 30 plus years experience and time that we've put into And I mean, Nkrumah called for the APRP in 1968. The APRP is not the only organization that's been putting in work for African people. But I am personally involved in an organization that has been putting in work for African people since 1968. Since Kwame Ture met with Amilcar Cabral, Sekou Touré, and Kwame Nkrumah in Guinea. That's what I'm interested in talking about, right? I'm interested in talking about organizations that are down with putting in work on behalf of African people. I may not agree with every organization's ideological framing and how they identify themselves. But if I see that you're putting in work for African people and you're not reactionary and you're revolutionary, I'm down with you, right? So for example, I'm down with the Nation of Islam. I am not Muslim, nor have I ever been in the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam and the APRP, our ideologies are different. But the Nation of Islam has been putting in work for the African community for many years, right? Those are the types of people and organizations I'm interested in having a real conversation about, right? And not necessarily individuals who have used social media, and not just this institution or anything, but have used social media to promote their own brand, right? And have used the hard work of our ancestors and those that came before us for 400, 500 years in order to promote themselves personally. That's an individualistic, very capitalistic approach to what we think is identity construction or even liberation. And so for me, I don't talk about anybody that participates in that type of identity construction. And I also think you're right that identity can be reactionary and it can be revolutionary. But I think, Jared, the thing about us walking around and saying we're thugs and we're bees and I'm about to knock you down because I'm like that, or I'm a capitalist, or I'm this, or whatever it is. The difference for me is that identity is not something that we have constructed radically, right? We've just accepted the identity in which we were given based on who we are, based on where we were born, based on what we look like, right? And someone in the chat mentioned something about class and race really being a determinant, right? And keeping people boxed in certain spaces. And so for me, I think that this is where we need to begin to have conversations around how do we do radical identity construction where people have both an individual and collective conversations and right to choose their identity. And see, here's the thing. I think someone just flashed about education, which I think is a really good point, is that education should equip us exactly, absolutely. Education should equip us to deal with our environment. And that education oftentimes dictates our identity construction, right? And so this is our Kwame Ture, our beloved Kwame Ture, rest in power, Kwame Ture. Where education, and Paulo Freire also said this, that education should be about transforming the way that we view ourselves in relationship to society. And if we're living in a society which is exploitative, not just against us, but against humanity, then we should be educated to realize that we are part and parcel of the transformation process to change society from being an exploitative one to being one that's collective, from a capitalist one to a socialist one. And even if some people are afraid of socialism, no problem. Ubuntu, perhaps. When we think through this question about how the people control the resources, I honestly don't care what you call it. You could call it, anything, as long as people have access to their resources, dictating their labor, dictating how much they're selling their products for, making sure that people have food, shelter, healthcare. That's what we need to be talking about about identity construction, not about anything else, but about people, the humanity, African people being able to control and manage their own affairs. There was something about IMF and World Bank International Finance that I think came up.
Before we move on from that, because there was one other piece to this idea of, for me at least, of reactionary identity formation. And I appreciate your point about how these are constructed versus imposed, and point well taken on that. But and I appreciate him being here and being active in the chat. But when Dhoruba bin Wahad was on with me several times ago to talk about Black liberation, BLM being Black Liberation Movement, not Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was one of the examples of this that I was thinking of just now. That this is a sort of and there could be some discussion about how much of this is imposed or coming from outside the Black community, but at least on the surface of the grand narrative of the origins of the hashtag is that this was something that emerged from 3 Black women across the diaspora who are creating this Black Lives Matter hashtag that to Dhoruba's point could be easily co-opted, redefined, rebranded, was sort of an empty vessel that had no demands or politics to it, which was always my critique of it. But that it has in some ways been used to identify us, if I can phrase it this way for this conversation, away from more radical formations like Black liberation, in terms of naming or labeling of a movement. Black Lives Matter is standing next to Black liberation movement doesn't sound right. It doesn't feel right. And I think certainly has a different politics to it that is being taken in a different way. But anyway, but Dhoruba had put up go ahead. Now I'll raise his point about the IMF World Bank again.
Excellent. No, I think that
did we lose Mjiba? Did you freeze entirely? Hopefully she can get her connection back. But anyway, hopefully while that's happening, let me see if she can. Let me see if she can get herself back here. And thank you, Dr. Ichile. I appreciate that for sure. Your presence and the comment. And actually, all of these comments are appreciated for sure. And hopefully we can get her back to talk more about that. But that was certainly something that I felt was an issue that Dhoruba had mentioned a few sessions back. And I invite people to go to imixwhatilike.org and grab that while we're waiting on Dr. Frehiwot to come back. Anyway, but to go to imixwhatilike.org, check that conversation out with Dhoruba. Wait, is this her? Is that you? There you go. Okay.
I'm back.
Got you back. Yep.
Yes.
I was trying to hold the fort down just very quickly. Anyway, imixwhatilike.org with Dhoruba on that whole conversation with Black Lives Matter and Black Liberation Movement. Go ahead, Dr. Frehiwot. You're back. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, so I thank you very much. So I think for me, honestly, I think the issue around identity construction is that and BLM, Black Lives Matter, and the Black Liberation Army or the Black Liberation Movement, I think that we can also steal, if I may not steal, but borrow perhaps, critical information or critical histories or critical moments in our movement to then use it and co-opt it as we feel necessary, right? And I think that that's what happened, quite frankly. And I think that you're right. I don't think that BLM or Black Lives Matter, necessarily is radical at all. I mean, it's not. I mean, the reality is that when you begin to say that our lives also matter and that we should protest police killings, I think it's a very narrow issue and a narrow approach to the fundamental contradiction of capitalism. Or we need radical transformation, right? And so, but that has always been the case where we've looked at and we've done protests around police killings, right? This was also the case with the civil rights movement, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, when you're looking at asking for civil rights or asking for voting, I mean, what does that do? Voting in a system in which you're oppressed, right? But then you had Kwame Ture began to change his ideology and said, well, no, this is just a tool for us to talk about a larger movement, or this is Malcolm X is saying, no, we must tear this system down because this system is not for you, versus earlier on when Malcolm is suggesting, we let's just all get along and we just want the same rights that everyone else does because we're human. So I think that what has happened with Black Lives Matter is that, quite frankly, they've co-opted the struggles that our ancestors and our comrades have done and to get us this far, right? They've co-opted it, they've used it, and they've used it's like you're skating on the waves of and the goodwill of the work that of those who have come before you, right? not recognizing that what was happening was radical and about transformation, versus what you're asking for is just acceptance. Listen, if folks are asking for acceptance into the American dream, and the only problem is that Black people don't have access to the same capital that white people do, that's fine. That's not necessarily my line. It's not radical, and history has shown us that is clearly not the way forward.
But my thing is that somewhat similar to what you're saying about who with whom I'm willing to work or support or engage is any group, any non-soda hashtag or group that looks to supplant or suppress or contradict previous or more radical histories or formations or efforts. That's where I start to want to engage critically or to but that to me is even different from we just don't all really agree, which is normal and not a problem. But I think there's a difference between that and what some of these others are now doing, at least at the surface, saying we are here to replace and improve upon and to look with negativity and hostility even towards those other groups. And specifically, I'm thinking of the ways in which, and in terms of the anti-soda group and Black Lives Matter, there are, one of the key differences in the way I'm seeing both anti-soda or reactionary identity formations operating is that the people operating at the grassroots level beneath Black Lives Matter, at least, often are welcoming of and are trying to adopt, not just symbolically, those radical traditions. I don't see them in the same ways that I see the people being encouraged to work at the grassroots levels of the anti-soda group.
Absolutely.
So I think that's one important distinction that I just want to raise. But I think the Ruben raises a question I'd like to hear you address real quick, because I do know we have to start to heading towards an end, unfortunately. But I did want to, especially with you living in Ghana and being part of the AAPRP, this question of the failure of Pan-Africans generally to establish concrete functional solidarity with other oppressed people, and that limiting our influence throughout the diaspora. What do you think about that? And then go ahead and with whatever else you wanted to add.
I 100%, 1,000% absolutely agree. I think that one of the things that I think is important is that when we're thinking about radical identity construction, oftentimes we confuse that, or the Pan-African movement, we confuse that with American existentialism, right? We confuse it with African people or Black people in America are the most oppressed people around the world, and we must be at the top of the oppression board, right? If you don't speak English, or you don't understand American dynamics, or you don't understand the hood in America, or you don't, like, all of a sudden, you're not relevant. And I think that's an error, honestly. And I would suggest it's Pan-Africanist. I would suggest that there's multiple types of Pan-Africanists, right? I think there are Pan-Africanists that embrace international struggles. Like, for example, I'm not trying to toot the APRP's horn. We all got problems, but the APRP sent some international observers to Venezuela to observe, elections and the upcoming transitions, right? So we're very clear about that, both in the APRP and me personally. I mean, I'm clear that this struggle is not just a struggle for Black people in America or just African people in general. Because if it wasn't the same struggle, then you can't. If it was just a singular struggle, you wouldn't be able to see the same types of conditions around the world, right? You wouldn't be able to see that Cuba has helped Africa transition from colonialism to independence, right? If it was just a singular struggle, one wouldn't see that Cuba has sent educators and doctors to Venezuela and to Ghana and to different spaces, and then Venezuela has sent oil around the world, right? So definitely, I wholeheartedly agree. So I think that there's that. I think that we because of our lack of political education And let me also say this, Jared, that I think that on the ground, Black Lives Matter, many Black Lives Matter movement organizers double as revolutionary Pan-Africanists to a certain extent, right? Or work with, because I'm thinking about the DC marches with National Black United Front, Answer Coalition, APRP was in the mix. I mean, this is before BLM or hashtag BLM came along. I mean, all you have to do is do Google and see all of the work that has been done around the question of police violence against unarmed folks, and the difference between that and some of the now Black Lives Matter marches is that we weren't talking about defund the police. We were saying that this capitalist system must be torn down. There's a fundamental difference, right? It was used as a political education tool and strategy. So there's one. I think that there are Pan-Africanists who lack political education. I think there are individuals who think they're Pan-Africanists, or they read Pan-African materials at 3 o'clock in the morning with incense burning and drinking some chamomile tea, and they think that makes them a Pan-Africanist. I think there are people who think they're Pan-Africanists because they go on YouTube and they talk about Pan-African material. I think there are people who think that they are Pan-Africanists because they wear red, black, and green, or they have locks, or they wear African attire, or they think that they don't participate in the capitalist system because they sell oils on the corner. No disrespect to anybody who sells oils. I love oil. All of these people have not done the hard work that many Pan-Africanists that came before us did. Many of these people have not been in work study circles. Many of these people have not been engaging and fighting collectively in organizations. Many of these people have not been in united fronts. Many of these people have not been in anti-Palestine coalitions. Many of these folks have not looked beyond their own individual brand and how Pan-Africanism can push their brand forward. So I would suggest that those folks, they are armchair revolutionary Pan-Africanists that are not connected to any organizations. There are some organizations that absolutely do not seem to understand the necessity to connect to struggles outside of the US. Some so much so that they fight against those of us who push for Palestine and say that we must support Palestine, right? People push back against that, and we push back and say that our Palestinians are our sisters and brothers, right? Certainly there are some challenges we have to overcome, but that doesn't mean that we should not fight against imperialism and Zionism in Palestine, right? People don't understand how come we push for Bolivia, or we talk about the struggles in Venezuela, or we always big up Cuba, right? No one seems to understand that if in fact they don't have political education, if in fact they're not in a political education process where they're talking through and doing history around revolutionary movements, right? And see, here's the difference, in my opinion, between people who are in Pan-African organizations, have been in Pan-African organizations, and folks that just call themselves Pan-Africanists, right? Some organizations certainly have some questionable or lack of line towards international movements. And we have to push them to look beyond their own block, right? We have to push people to look beyond the US, because the US, first off, the US, the land in which we call the United States of America, is indigenous people's land. So if you are claiming that land, you better have a significant portion of indigenous DNA, and you must be connected to that community. If you are not of that community, you should really be rethinking whether you should be claiming that land or not. That doesn't say that we don't acknowledge that people have fought and died and people were enslaved on that land. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. But we have to recognize historically that this is indigenous people's land. And once we recognize that, we will absolutely 100% be in solidarity with folks beyond our own space. And so 100% I agree. 25 minutes later.
No, it's all good, and just wanted to highlight what Baba Daruba is saying. Witness how Biden appointed Susan Rice as domestic, and then of course he also appointed Linda Thomas Greenfield who is a Black woman, to what is the role she's supposed to play. And we talked about this a little while ago, but to play something in his cabinet. But she does something. She had been around going back to Obama's administration, also a Black woman who does foreign finance investment policy and has worked with the continent of Africa before, throughout the continent of Africa, just more or less trying to pave the way through using her Pan-African identity to pave the way for U.S. and Western business, I'm sure, to get policy support for their investments and return on their investments. So there are even reactionary Pan-African arrangements that I think you've alluded to and talked about some as well.
And can I also say that, you know what, the thing is, you may not be in the people's class, right? That's the other thing. Are you in the people's class or are you in the anti-people's class? It doesn't matter whether you're Black, brown, purple, or blue. If you're in the anti-people's class, you're not down with the people, right? And that's what these Susan Rice and all these people, I don't even think about these folks because they're not down with you. They're not down with us. Like, they're not concerned about you and Africa and African people. Thank you so much, right? You know, this is about here's the thing. Many African people have a political and economic allegiance to the upper middle, petty bourgeois, Eurocentric class. And so these are not the people that we should be looking to even claim. As a matter of fact, beyond the fact that they have distanced themselves from us as African people, we should not be claiming them. And so I think that is a really good point. And I think that this point that's being made now, the enemy, throw that back up there, because I think the enemy has institutional memory, while Black activists and radicals are not in touch with their radical legacy. 100%. 100%. And I'll say there's three reasons for that. One, there's a lack of political education, right? Two, it's unfortunate, but I think that sometimes when the struggle or repression is not as heavy, we believe to think that we're free, because we're not free. Three, I think that with time and space, we as Pan-Africanists, and I take full responsibility for this, we let down the pressure, right? And there's a disconnect between us and the next or third generation. And for historically, economically, and politically, geopolitics oftentimes dictates whether people are active or are politically active, right? So like if you look at the 90s, like the early to mid 90s, you had anti-apartheid movement, you had some serious intifada, struggles in Palestine. I mean, so you had the anti-war movement. So people were on the streets all the time talking about political education, right? And now let's fast forward to 2006, 2007. People are now talking about the first Black president in America. Everything is great. Old life is amazing, right? So people went to sleep. And this is a human, Sekou Touré says this in Revolution, Culture, and Pan-Africanism. He talks about how we must transform, right? He talks about how human transform, and it's a constant process to consistently transform our ideology. And at some point, that constant process really fell down. And the other problem is we don't have state power. So when you don't have state power, it's very difficult to push in a global ideological transformation. Because if you go to Cuba, for example, where there's state power, you see that constant political education. If you go to Venezuela, 2000, when Hugo Chavez, there was a coup d'etat against his presidency by the CIA, the people marched to make the military let him go. That's collective political education. This right here is what we lack. There's a lot of reasons why we lack it, but this is a fundamental reason why there's a disconnect. And we have to begin to ask ourselves, how do we transform humanity? Certainly it's through political and economic power, but if you have political and economic power, you can be as oppressive as your oppressor. That's what Paulo Freire said, the oppressed, they fight to be just like, to replace the oppressor. So how do we transform our ideology to make sure that in society there's a dominant ideology which is people centered, and there's a small ideology which is profit centered, because all ideologies have contesting ideologies, right?
Yeah, no question. And
Revolutionary
Daruba,
intellectual activism. Exactly. The latte. Exactly.
But I wanted you to
Exactly.
get.
I agree.
I wanted to get you to respond here, if you could, real quick. And then, unfortunately, we are going to have to get ready to wrap up.
Oh no.
Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately, I have classes and whatnot to prepare for,
I
and
understand.
you know that HBCU life of 4 4s is a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. But
I hear you.
we at least take some time to deal with this question of explaining from your perspective. Although I know it was Daruba that brought this up initially. I think it's a legit question. The connection between Susan Rice and the middle class. My 2 cents very quickly on this would be just somebody coming out of the Brookings Institution, you know, Clinton's Secretary of State for Africa Affairs. You know, she's a very establishment woman wrapped in blackness, meant to carry very neoliberal policies through that identity, that imposed racialized identity that she has not gone through. She has not taken through the radical transformation process that we've been talking about here. So so even most recently, I saw her on Roland Martin talking about why Black people need to vote for Biden, as if and making literally the argument that this was an existential threat, that Trump was an existential threat to, quote unquote, our country, that is the United States of America, and that therefore Black people had as their duty. In other words, so she's taking her blackness, this identity of blackness, and dragging it towards the reactionary poles that she's been selected to pull us toward. So that's how I would answer it, that, you know, she's taking a very middle class, although, you know, she's certainly at the upper end of that middle class to the extent, you know, that means anything at this point. But she's taking that aspiration, that ideological perspective into this Black womanhood for those men. Anyway, what do you think about that?
Yeah, first of all, I wholeheartedly agree. I think there's a couple of things. One, we all have class interests, right? Mm-hmm. And so those of us find ourselves, I am not in the upper middle class, but those people who find themselves in the upper class or middle class, they want to maintain their class position. With that class position comes power. With that class positions comes appointments. You know, with that class position comes a certain ideology, right? Because you can only maintain that class position with a certain ideology. And I'll liken it to this. You know, you have a job that offers you $200,000 to start, right? But you can't come out and you can't criticize the company for oppressing Black people or African people, because your check needs to come at the end of the month and you want that $200,000 lifestyle. This has always been Susan Rice. This has always been Colin Powell. They're more dedicated and committed to their class than they have ever been to Black people. And be clear, the only reason why she's going on Roland Martin and these other places and acting like she's a Black person now is because they want her to be the face of Black folks. Have you ever seen Susan Rice talk about she's a Black woman? Have you ever seen her out representing Black folks? She ain't never done that. Why? Because she doesn't believe that she is connected to the larger Black African nation. She somehow believes that her class position and the class that she's more, and again, this goes back to identity construction. We identify with our class also, and our ability to stay in that class determines if we properly represent that class on all spaces. So if we are the frontline cannon fodder of those class exploitations, then we're fine. And that's what she is. So she's just like the puppet And the massa has said, go down to Roland Martin and cool out all of these Black nationalists, these Black people who are saying that Biden is anti-Black. That's all it is. That's the only reason why he's appointing all these Africans, is because they want all of these progressive, quote unquote, Democrats to kneel down and be quiet, because somehow these African people will have your best interests at heart. And let me say this, and I'll end it here. The only African person in America that has your best interests at heart is the African person who's talking about tearing down the American U.S. imperialist system.
Yeah, I mean, including, you know, and it's not just to shut up the progressives in Congress so much, to these Black appointees. It's to so that Biden can yell at these nominal Black leaders like he did in that phone call the other day, and tell them when they say, but what about actual policy? Even Derek Johnson of the NAACP sounded like Malcolm X on that call almost, talking about what about Black farmers? And Biden's response was, you know, what? I've done more for you than anybody. And what are you talking about? And I have the most diverse cabinet. I have this and I've done that. And none of it had any substance. Meanwhile, he's appointing Susan Rice's and Greenfield Thompson's and the brother from the Army, the general who I can't remember, but who works for Raytheon. That's who he's appointing. And listen,
yeah. I know we have to go, but there's three things that were just said.
Deruba got a broadcast? What broadcast? I didn't know Deruba had a broadcast. We can start broadcasting.
I don't know if I can come today, but please, can I reschedule? I'm begging you. I'm grading papers. But I just wanted to say that this point about this is just as the Cold War popularity interrupted the African decolonization struggle, resulting in the need for Bandung. Exactly. This is it. I mean, this is history repeating itself. This is it. You know, the people are pushing back. And like you said, when Derek Johnson of the NAACP sounds like Malcolm, it's a little bit ridiculous, you know? So not ridiculous as a bad thing, as in people are now beginning to see that what it is that they like when you fight against, or when you vote for the lesser of two evils, you never get what you need. So why don't we just fight for what you need? If you're fighting because you want to get Trump out or whatever, why not just fight for what it is that you think you actually need? And see, this is the problem as African people that we've had, is that we oftentimes are fighting for scraps at the table, but we need to just make our own table.
I can't think of a better way to end it there. Dr. Mjiba Frehiwot, thank you very much for joining us this morning. And I want to remind everybody that they can see more of her apparently on the Deruba Bin Wahad show that's going to be coming up at some point soon. And also with our Blacklash, the Africana Collective BTAC group, the links to which are in the YouTube and at imixwhatilike.org. So please check us out there. Again, I want to thank Dr. Freyat very much, and thank all of you as well for joining us and joining me. Please like, subscribe, retweet, share, all of that good stuff so you don't miss anything. And we have a lot more great conversations coming up with more of our BTAC collective, so much more. So check out imixwhatilike.org and see who's coming up. Check our YouTube page out as well. Thanks again to everybody who joined us today and added to the conversation. Shout out again to the Godfather, Tom Porter, and of course, Deruba Bin Wahad. And of course, as always, like Fred Hampton used to say, peace if you're willing to fight for it, everybody. So peace. We'll catch you next time.
I mix what I like.